Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Friday Spotlight feature. My name is Shivangi Garg, and today's session is going to be about USI integration. Because this is a common feature for all meshed products, including users from Meshed Higher Ed, Meshed Cracos, as well as Meshed Vet platform, we do have a mixed audience today. So some screenshots or some pictures may look a bit different, but the feature overall is standard. If you have any questions throughout the session, feel free to pop it in the chat with your name along with the college name and email so that we can reach out to you after the session's over. So let's make a start and have a look at today's agenda. So, in today's session, we'll cover a list of topics as you can see on your screen here. So, we'll start by understanding what a USI actually is before we actually jump into the meshed USI integration. So, we'll understand what is a USI and who actually needs a USI. So, what are the student categories who need a USI? And then we'll further explore some of the USI exemptions. So USI registry also grants some exemptions. So we'll also have a look to understand when are these exemptions granted or if the student can be eligible for these exemptions. We'll then see why is a USI actually needed? What is the reason that we need a USI in the system for all students? And how the USI integration with mesh system operates. Within the USI integration for mesh system, we would also try and understand the USI machine credentials. And then we will talk about further features that can be used within the meshed USI integration. For example, the document verification service, student consent, and how the student consent form can be used on the student portal. Recording USIs for application offers students. Some of the common USI errors that we have seen across different providers, a report that you can run in the system on missing student USIs, and the permission that you can grant to your staff for USI processes and generation. So, making a start, let's try and understand what a USI is. So, as we all know, USI stands for Unique Student Identifier, which is an individual education number for life. Every student who gets a USI retains that USI throughout their education history. It is a number that is made up of 10 numbers and letters and follows a certain algorithm as specified by the USI department. It was initially implemented in 2012 by COAG, and the USI initiative is supported by Student Identifiers Act 2014. A USI is mostly needed because it creates a government authorized record or a USI transcript, as we call it, for an individual's vocational education or vet training in Australia, which we are also going to further explore in the upcoming slides. If you need to understand more about USI in detail, you can always go to the USI registry link that I've mentioned in this slide, and you will be able to see what a USI is along with further details on the same. We are going to share the presentation slides as well as the recording later on, so which will help you to kind of access all the links and information that's mentioned in the slides. Moving on, let's talk about who needs a USI. So now we know USI is a number, a 10-digit number that is provided for a student. So who are the students or what are the student categories that actually require a USI? So there are two broad range, as you can see. First is any student who is undertaking any NRT or nationally recognized training for vet or vocational education training. And the second category is for higher education students who are starting or graduating their courses 2023 or after. So the USI for higher education is mandatory starting from 1st of January 2023. So these are the two broad categories of students who require USI in Australia. Having said that, as I mentioned before, there are some USI exemptions that are available. Now, there are three categories of USI exemptions. The very first category is the pre 2023 studies. So, as I did talk about, that for the higher education sector, USI is mandatory since 1st of January 2023. So, any student who has completed their studies before 2023 in the higher education sector do not really require a USI unless they are starting a new course. There are also USI exemptions granted for offshore students. So, any student who is not going to enter Australia or has never been in Australia for any part of their vet or higher education study does not really need a USI. For any vet student who is an offshore student, int of is the value that is automatically reported by the mesh system in the NAT files based on the student's funding source 32. So if a student is an offshore student, you do not really need to record a USI for that student. And the last are the individual exemptions that USI registry grants based on students' individual circumstances and application. If an individual does not want to have a USI and would like to apply for an exemption, they need to do it via filling out an application to the USI registry. And once it is approved, the department may grant an exemption, and the exemption code is INDIV, as you can see on the slide here. So, if your student has an exemption, then you do not require a USI. But if the student does not fall in any of these exemptions, then we definitely need a USI recorded for the student. So, why is a USI needed? So, a USI is mostly needed for the following, as you can see on your slide. So, these are again the broad or the primary categories where a USI is required. So, the first or the foremost reason for the student needing a USI is to access their vet USI transcripts. If a student is studying any NRT course, any vocational education training course, they do need to have access to their USI transcripts, which get updated based on the AWETMIS data that the RTOs report to NCVR every year. So, if a student does not have a USI number, their vet transcripts cannot be updated, and thus the student will never have access to them. So, a USI is really important for a vet student. Second category is for a student who is graduating a higher ed course. As we have talked about in the initial slides, for any student who is graduating a course after 2023, a USI is mandatory to receive their graduation awards. In third place, we have any student who is enrolling in a Commonwealth supported place or a CSP. If a student wants to enroll in a Commonwealth subsidized place, they have to have a USI for the department to record their data. And finally, we have the students who want to take a loan or a help loan, as we call it, for higher education as well as for any vet courses. So, this includes any HEX courses, any fee help loans, or any vet student loans. Because the student ultimately will need to fill out an ECAF form as well as CAN notices and invoice notices. All of them require USIs to be there. Now, having understood what is a USI, if there are any exemptions available, or why a USI is needed, let's see how the mesh system can help with the USI integration. The mesh system has a USI integration which allows for a two-way exchange between the system as well as the USI registry, which uses a web service connection. As you can see here, this is the tile where you will find the USI integration in the mesh system. What it allows you to do is three broad features, which is to create a student USI. So, if you wish to create a USI for any of your students, you can do that directly using the integration without having to go to the USI registry. It also allows you to locate a USI for a student. So, if the student has not provided a USI, before creating one for the student, you are also able to try and retrieve any existing USI for the student. And finally, you can also verify any matching records for the student, given that the USI is already available. So let's talk about this further in terms of USI integration. So before you can actually use the three features that I've talked about in the previous slide, it's important to set up the integration in the mesh system. Again, this is a very broad information on how the setup should be done. So as you can see, I have divided it into 5 steps here. Any client or any provider who is using the USI integration for the first time with the mesh system may need to start at step 1, which is USI system access request form. But any provider who has had an existing integration with the SMS and has only had the credentials expire or need to renew the credentials may start at step 3 or step 4, depending on the device they are using. So let's talk about it in a bit more detail. So the first step obviously is the USI system access request, which starts even before integrating the USI to the mesh system. So this is a prerequisite. So you need to have to fill up the form as provided through this link. So once you go to this link, you need to fill out a system access request form specifying why and how you wish to use the USI web service. Once the access is granted, only then you will be able to set up the USI integration with the mesh system. When you're filling out this form, it's very important that you make sure the ABN number, the legal name, and the college details that you're providing match with the mesh system. If they do not match, then you will see some errors when the integration starts to run. So after the access is granted, or meanwhile the access is being granted, you can go to RAM or Relationship Authorization Manager and obtain a digital identity in RAM for your college. Once all this setup is done, then step 3 may or may not be required depending on the device that you're using. So, for creating machine credentials in RAM in MyGov, you require a separate browser extension, which is a software add on. If that software is already compatible on your device, then this step will be simply skipped. Moving to step 4 is where you create the key store or the machine credentials, which is again in RAM. So, as you can see, up till step 4, you do not really need the mesh system. It's only after step 4 that the USI integration gets established with the mesh system. So, once you have the machine credentials, you will then come to the mesh system and upload those details or the files in the system and get the service running. As you can see, this is where you can set up the machine credentials or the USI service configuration. So this is again on the same USI page, you will have the mass SD configuration icon. Once you go in here, you will see there are a few options or fields for you to fill up data. And we'll talk about these fields in the upcoming slides. But as you can see, it allows you to reset the configuration, as well as if you have never done the configuration, this section will be completely empty and you will be simply able to upload the file and upload the passcode to set up the integration. So let's see what actually are these fields and what data do they require, because this is a very frequent question that comes up from most of the colleges. So you can take a note of it if you like. So the first field in the previous slide that you can see is the mass SD key ID. Now, mass SD key ID is the subject name ID of the machine credential that you create in the Relationship Authorization Manager in step 2. So this RAM, wherever you get the subject name ID of the credential, you just need to simply copy it and paste it in the mesh system. The mass SD passcode is the key store password. So when you're creating the key store in RAM, you will be prompted to provide a new password. So make sure you store that password somewhere, because when you enter the details in the mesh system, you will eventually need to record the password as well, and it must match the RAM website, whatever you have created. And finally, we have the keystore.xml file. So this file is actually the machine credential or the file that you download from RAM. Once you download the file, you need to upload that file in the mesh system. Usually, whenever you create this file in the RAM, there is a default location or a path that will be populated. It's recommended not to change that key store path, but if you change it, make sure you record it somewhere, because locating the file sometimes can be a problem. Also, a note here that the key store file expires every 2 years from the date of creation. And once it expires, your USI integration within the mesh system will stop functioning. So keep a note of the date, and before the key store file expires, you have to create a new key store file following the steps as we talked about before. So once you have the USI integration all set up in the system, you can actually start to use the features as we talked about. So first is the document verification service, or DVS. The USI registry system uses DVS to verify details using the identification documents for an individual. Usually, to create a student's USI or to update any personal details such as their first name, last name, date of birth, you require a verifiable Australian identification document. So, as you can see in the first screenshot here, these are the acceptable form of DVS or acceptable form of ID documents that USI accepts, and all of them are available in the mesh system here for you to record data for a student. Again, if you need to understand more about the DVS service, you can always go to this link and check it out further. Now, before you can actually create a USI for a student or locate a USI or verify a USI, one of the most important thing is student consent. USI registry has strict guidelines about student consent, and it is something that is required by a provider to create, search, or verify a student USI. Having the student consent also permits the providers to view and update student USI transcripts as and when needed. There could be multiple ways that you can obtain this consent. Some of them, as you can see, I've listed here. So, the first way, which we are also going to talk about in the next slide, is using the meshed student portal to record the consent for the student. So, we will see how the student consent form within the meshed portal can be a great way to record student consent and manage USI integration. If you're not using the student portal to record the consent form, having your 5 step application's terms and conditions to include something about USI consent can be another great way to manage student consent. You can include some terms and conditions about it and upload them into the mesh system. Third way, which is also common across a few providers, is to include additional questions within the existing application. You can do so by creating extra custom fields in the system and include explicit questions about USI consent. Finally, there could be some other manual forms or manual declarations that you may be asking the students to sign at your end, or something that you maintain outside of the system. But even those documents you can always upload back into the mesh system under student document upload. And there could be some other ways that we have not covered in these slides. But anyhow, the overall point that we are trying to make here is you must have a student consent before you try to do anything with the student USI or USI transcripts. So let's talk about student portal consent form as we were looking at in the previous slide. If you have Mesh Student Portal and once a student logs in as on their portal, they would be able to see the style as USI request, which allows them to fill up the consent form. This consent form also allows them to record the DVS document and provides the list of DVS documents that are acceptable. Once the student has filled out the consent form, the system sends an email to the student confirming the consent form submission. This is a predefined email template, and the name of the template is given here if you want to make edits to it. And it also stores the USI consent form as well as the DVS document under student document upload. Once the student has completed these steps from their system, the system automatically loads it on the USI page, so you no longer have to do it manually. Now, after you have the USI integration running and you have the DVS, you have everything done, all the previous steps checked, you can actually start to record USIs for the student in the system. You could be recording USI at application step 1. The system allows you to record USI at application stage itself. If the USI is not recorded at application, you can always record it once it is converted to an offer. But if it is missed at an offer stage as well, you can still go to a student's individual profile and record it there as well. Now let's talk about some of the common USI errors. Now, while recording the USI, you may find out that you're experiencing some errors or the system's not letting you record USI and you're seeing some messages in red. Now, the most common errors are listed here. So, the first one that we've seen is mismatch of student details. There could be cases where the student's first name, last name, date of birth do not match. Usually, the best approach in these kind of situations is to ask the students to send an email from the USI registry Once the student logs into their USI registry, they can trigger an email from USI to the college, which gives you the details of the student details that they have entered while creating the USI. However, if you have students with single name, you can always use the first name in the first name field in the system and use the last name as a dot. You can just put a dot in the last name field if a student has a single name, and that should be able to verify student USI. Second most common case of not being able to record USI in the system is expired key store or machine credentials. As we talked about in the last slide, the credentials expire every 2 years. So if they are not renewed, the system will not let you record USI and you will see an error message which will tell you that your key store has expired. So in that case, what you need to do is again go to RAM and follow all the steps to recreate the machine credentials. And finally, if your organization is not verified in the USI web service, this error usually appears when you have not filled up the system access request form, which is the first step, or if the access granted by USI web service to your college is limited, or the organization details such as ABN number, legal name, and others do not match with USI enmeshed. So these are the three most common errors that you will see in the system when USI integration is operational. There is also a report that you can run on missing student USIs. So if you want to see who are the students who do not have a USI in the system, you can go to student services category and there is a report by the name student list with missing USI number studying between two dates. You can filter out the dates, the course and statuses as you like, and this will give you a list of students who do not have a USI number recorded. This is important because as an education provider, for you, USI is needed for the students and it can cause errors and warnings in multiple areas in the system, including the compliance areas. If the USI is not present, you will see when generating certificates in the system, you may see some sort of warning from the system indicating a missing USI. While reporting data to TCSI for higher education, for a vet miss for vet, or while generating CAN and invoice notices when sending ECAF enrollments, you will see that the USI is a required field and not having USI can be an issue. Finally, there is also a permission that you can grant to your staff to allow for USI processes and generation. By default, any user who has SAdmin access in the system has the access to USI feature. However, if you want to grant it to any other user roles in the system, you have to go under admin, set up permission, and then you can specify the USI permissions as well. This will allow that user to record, verify, and locate USI for that student and to also access the USI feature in general. So this almost covers the USI feature within the mesh system. We strongly recommend that if you do not have the USI setup done in your system yet, please check it at your end. If you need any help, you can always log a ticket at support@meshgroup.com.au. And for any further questions that you have for the session today, please feel free to write them in the chat. Thank you.